Our reading today comes from Exodus 1, verses 12 through 2, verses 10. But the more they were oppressed, the more that they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks upon the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do what the king of Egypt commanded them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" But the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. But the Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and while her attendants walked by the river, she saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." The word of the Lord. Grace and peace to you from God, our Creator, from Jesus, our Savior, and from the Holy Spirit who sustains us. This text is both a devastating story, but it's also a profound story of resilience. It's a story about the fear of the Lord. It's also a sad one because it's one where this huge empire invokes genocide. We've had lots of different genocides throughout our history, and it's deeply heartbreaking and tragic each time. Some of this text may sound a little bit familiar to the Gospel of Matthew, which we've been walking through in our lectionary, because Matthew is actually mimicking the Exodus narrative. The birth story of Jesus and Moses are somewhat similar. In Matthew, Herod's the one who seeks to kill the infants, to kill Jesus, out of a fear that he would become a greater ruler than Herod was. The Hebrew people are the people that Jesus comes from. And Jesus goes to this place, to Egypt, where our story begins, because they're hiding away from Herod to find safety. The Hebrew people arrive in Egypt, which isn't their homeland, because they had a famine in their own land. And when they got there, they're first dealt with super kindly. They're able to raise their families, to build their houses, to immerse themselves in the lives of the Egyptians. The Egyptians help them get food and to nourish them. They find security at first, but eventually a new leader rises up, a Pharaoh. And he had a thirst for power, a thirst for control, and a thirst for certainty. He first tries to control the Israelites by enslaving them. making them build things for him, and to help the nation of Egypt flourish. But the Hebrews don't get to reap the benefits. Pharaoh is afraid that he will lose control, that he'll lose power. Pharaoh's fear begins to spread to the people. This fear creates derogatory thinking in them as well, because this fear starts to spread. It's somewhat similar to how racism infects us in an American context. Racism is a way that it creates individual bias in our own hearts, but also creates systemic discrimination to control people. If and when we allow derogatory thinking to impact us, we'll sometimes allow for atrocity to happen, and we'll encourage it at times. When the Israelites are enslaved, they continue to grow in numbers, which was exactly the thing that Pharaoh was trying to prevent. The text says that the more they were oppressed, the more that they multiplied and spread so that the Egyptians came to dread them. Pharaoh was already afraid that they would grow in numbers, and he puts them in slavery and generates violence against them. But their multiplication is this sort of mode of resistance. It's a way that they're resisting Pharaoh because they're doing the exact opposite of what he wanted. But in this, Pharaoh becomes even more afraid. And we see this fear spread again, creating more oppression. And they eventually act out of this fear and this loss of control. This fear specifically allows for Pharaoh to act even more maliciously. And that's where our story begins, with some really bold and brave women. Pharaoh approaches Shiphrah and Puah. They're two midwives. Midwives are people that help women through childbirth. It's an immensely beautiful and wonderful time. Midwives work in holy work. But Pharaoh orders them to kill all the Hebrew boys that get delivered on the birth stool. The birth stool is sort of like at the end of a hospital bed. So what he's trying to do is to get them, to kill them before their mothers even see them, to tell their mothers that they died in childbirth or that they were stillborn. This is super duper wicked. He tries to get them to betray the trust that they have earned from being midwives. But the text says that the midwives feared God. Rather than fearing a tyrant, a people group, they fear the Lord. The fear of the Lord means that we are in awe of who God is, and that the magnificence of the Lord. Fearing God prompts us to defer to the way that God does things, to pursue what God says is right. The fear of the Lord prompts us towards the arc of justice. And Shiphrah and Puah model this. They're resolute that this would be wrong. They're resolute that they won't participate in this devastation. These two women stand up to a tyrant and refuse to do his dirty work, because fearing God can cultivate this sort of resistance in our spirits, so that when we're asked to participate in violence or injustice, we might withstand it, just as Shiphrah and Puah do. They continue to attend to the births as they look down on these baby boys with love and with faith in God. They deliver them to their mothers, and they grow. The Hebrew people grow, and many lives are saved. But after some time, we're not really sure how long it could have been. It could have been months, or it could have been years. The Pharaoh realizes what they have done, and he summons them to him. He questions them and asks them why they have allowed these boys to live. Shiphrah and Puah respond, saying that the Hebrew women are more vigorous. In Hebrew, this is the word for animalistic. At least that's the root word. They sort of respond using derogatory language from using Pharaoh's sort of racism against him. They say that the Hebrew women are different, that they are more lively than Egyptian women, that they give birth faster and deliver babies before the midwives get there. This is clearly a lie that plays into Pharaoh's own racism, and in the process, they're able to manipulate him. They get off. Frankly, I'm a little unsure of what to do with this response. Part of me admires their creative spirit, and part of me wonders if this is sort of a corruption that has infiltrated them. Commentators are super conflicted on if Shiphrah and Puah are Hebrew women, or if they're Egyptian women who just served the Hebrews during their time of labor. It's a somewhat small detail, but it really impacts how we read this story. Have they allowed this insidious view to happen to them? Are they preserving life while still promoting racism in their hearts? Or if they're Hebrew people, have they allowed the derogatory thinking that happens around them to affect themselves inside? Or could it be that they're just using this as a tactic altogether against Pharaoh? I'm not really sure. The text doesn't really say, but the text does say that God gives them families, that God deals well with them, and deals well with the Hebrew people too, continuing to multiply them and continuing to have them grow in strength. As a woman, I hear the strength of women's resistance and resilience for the fight of greater freedom and liberation. I've seen the countless of unpaid labor that women have worked throughout history. I remember places that women weren't allowed to serve in church where it would be crazy that a woman was up here preaching to you. It would be unimaginable that women would become CEOs or doctors or work anywhere at all. I'm amazed at the resilience and the fight for our liberation. And I'm really grateful to be able to walk the paths that women before me have paved. I also hear the stories, though, of those who have been left out of the liberating work. I hear about women of color making less than white women, as many have ignored their cries against racism. I'm reminded of women behind bars working and getting unfair wages still today, sometimes as little as low as $1 a week. As a queer woman, I hear the stories of lesbians, bisexuals, and gay women pushed aside while they were getting fired for who they love and who they deem as a family. I see trans folks being rejected still today. I have heard how these insidious narratives about who people are seep into their minds, and I have watched that fear multiply and launch itself as hate into the public sphere. There's a documentary on Netflix called Disclosure, in which trans creatives discuss the role of Hollywood's impact on the trans community, the role of movies that tell really insidious stories and plant things within people to fear trans women and to other trans people as well. Actress Laverne Cox says, I think for a long time in which trans people have been represented on screen have suggested that we're not real, have suggested that we're mentally ill, that we don't exist. Yet here I am, here we are, and we've always been here. She says later that I can't tell you how many times I've been in public space, particularly early on in my transition in New York City, where I would walk into a subway car and people would just burst into laughter, as if my existence on that subway was just a joke. And I think that people have been trained to have that reaction. This is an example about how derogatory narratives impact real people's lives. They impact their vulnerable moments, and they treat people like objects. They put people at the end of a joke, and they put fear in people's minds so that oppression can continue. Just like Pharaoh had derogatory views of the Hebrew people, so many people have derogatory views of LGBTQ folks, particularly trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. But who will we fear? Will we fear the people that society has called us to hate, or will we fear the Lord? These views that seep into the mind eventually seep into our systems. Last year, so many states passed the so-called Don't Say Gay bills, each of which had various policies in the education system restricting teachers who are trans or have same-sex partners to hide themselves and their families from their students. These bills keep informative books about sexuality and LGBTQ lives out of libraries. They restrict kids from coming out legally. And if students do, teachers are legally required in many cases to tell their families. I can say that coming out is such a vulnerable moment. And after having been plagued with the fear of trust that it could be betrayed is almost unbearable to think of. In this vulnerable moment, kids' stories could be stolen and shared to people that might kick them out of homes. Now, I know that's somewhat of a weird way to look at parents, but for many LGBTQ people, that's the fear that they have when they tell people who they are. They're afraid that they'll be rejected or ignored or abandoned. These fears have seeped into our nation's conscience and continue to oppress marginal people. In this country, there are over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills right now. They started last year in states a little bit far from us. But this year in North Carolina, there are 2 bills that are seeking to discriminate against LGBTQ folks in our own state. One bill similar to the Don't Say Gay bill has already passed the North Carolina Senate and is going to the House. Another bill before the House will legislate against trans health care and prohibit people from under 18 getting gender-affirming care. Just as Pharaoh's derogatory views seeped eventually into the political system, our societies have been seeped with our own fear into our systems. But who will we fear? Will we fear the people that that society has called us to hate, or will we fear God? Every year on November 20th, the queer community remembers the lives of transgender and gender nonconforming people who died to anti-transgender violence. In the US alone last year, there were 70 deaths. Globally, there were 391. This year, there have already been 21 in the US and 141 deaths globally. And these are just the people who died, whose numbers were reported on. Who do we fear? Do we fear the people that society calls us to hate, or do we fear the Lord? How will we look upon God's children? Will we seek their flourishing? Will we call them beloved? Will we be like Shiphrah and Puah to seek the flourishing of those who are facing death? Will we be able to counter narratives that lead people to these actions? This may feel like a weird question to ask this place. This place welcomes and affirms all people. We say so often, and I just said it earlier, all are welcome, no exceptions. I believe that this place believes that. But what will we do in the face of unjust laws? Whose prosperity will we seek? And what happens if we stay silent, if we do nothing in the face of injustice happening in our state, in our country, and in our schools? The Exodus story continues, and Pharaoh eventually realizes that he cannot depend on Shiphrah and Puah to murder these children. But he then orders that every boy born shall be thrown into the Nile. One woman, her name is Yocheved, she gives birth to a baby boy. She hides him for 3 months, and eventually she makes a basket for him as she places him in the water. Yocheved sends him off, hoping and trusting that he would be safe. And her daughter Miriam watches among the reeds. Eventually, the daughter of the Pharaoh comes and finds him. She recognizes that he's Hebrew, but she has pity on him, the text says, and wants to look after him because she cares for him. Pharaoh's daughter gives Yocheved wages to care for the baby until he is old enough. And when he eventually grows up and returns to Pharaoh's daughter, he is given the name Moses. Moses will grow up to lead the people into deliverance, to free them from slavery with God. These women raise him, they care for him, they provide for him. And because they look out for him, he is eventually able to lead them into a great liberation. Exodus is the Hebrew people's liberation text. It's a text that they go on to tell generations and generations of how they're freed. It's a text that we still celebrate and that Jewish people still celebrate. This text begins with 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, whose actions and fear of the Lord goes on to support the deliverance of Hebrew people from slavery. I wonder what our stories of liberation will be right now. Who will be the folks out there countering narratives that seep into people's lives? Who will be the people calling senators and representatives and saying this is wrong? And who will be the people that are betraying the tyrants, that are betraying the instructions? Who will be the folks caring for children, preserving their lives? One example within the queer community is a story about drag story hours. It's hosted at local libraries and bookstores and other community spaces. Drag's a mode of performance and an embodiment that some LGBTQ people partake in as they exaggerate an aspect of gender and perform it. Drag can help some people imagine aspects of themselves that they don't always let out. It's a way of performing and of being oneself. The story hours allow kids to listen to drag kings and queens and performers about being one's true self. These stories are important. And according to their website, Drag Story Hour captures the imagination and the play of gender fluidity, of childhood, and gives kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models. In spaces like this, kids are able to see people who defy rigid gender restrictions and imagine a world where everyone can be their authentic selves. This is one way of cultivating a spirit of resistance, by helping people imagine and define for themselves of who they want to be. We get to hear so many stories of resilient people. It's also important to look out for the resilient stories of LGBTQ folks and to continue to imagine how we can fear God in our own lives and how we can pursue God's way of doing things, to love all people that we encounter. Colonel West is a theologian and an activist. He says that justice is what love looks like in public. It's a way that we see and look on those who are forgotten and ignored. This is one way that folks are finding liberation for themselves, and that we continue to imagine ways that we can journey alongside folks, that we can fight unjust discrimination, and that we can expand who we consider to be our own community. Who do we fear? Do we fear the Lord? Do we continue to long for and imagine the liberation of people on the margins? Do we continue to expand love that God calls us to? Shifra and Pua are bold women who defy the words of a tyrant. Yehoved is a bold woman who bravely protects her own child. Miriam is a bold woman who watches and protects her baby brother. Pharaoh's daughter is a bold woman who pushes beyond stereotypes of racism and adopts a son. How will we be bold women today? How will we be bold people today that follow after God? Who do we fear? Will we fear the Lord? Amen.